This year, 2025, has been a real low for anti-fandom on the internet. More than people just being tired of the same talking points without any new insights, which could happen to anyone, I'm sure, there's this trend of anti-woke content that I've been seeing pop up. The inspiration for this feels obvious to me, someone who has been talking about this for a hot minute online, but who has only been focusing on video essay content during this period. There's a shift happening. In the United States of America, the political situation domestically has clarified to a lot of Americans, and some who may yet begin to notice, what we were all enjoying in past years that we might begin to miss if our society follows this self-destructive right-wing trend. Seeing as there's really no comparable trend with that level of organized violence and institutional power behind it in America in living memory, many have referred to this as living in unprecedented times. I said in a previous video that I was basically done talking about the trend of anti-woke content creators until I had something new to say, as I had put almost all my thoughts together as coherently as I could, and in as much detail as I could manage in a 3-hour video essay last April. Hopefully the fact that I then proceeded to basically drop that topic almost entirely for the next 5 months shows that statement was made in good faith. I even uploaded a video in that time frame talking about the rhetoric I'd seen online surrounding the games industry, but I refused to directly engage with anti-woke creators on their terms in it, instead focusing on my own feelings and ideas. This will be the third time in almost half a year since that much longer video, The Truth About Anti-Woke Grifters, that I've touched on this stuff directly in my own content. If anything I'm saying feels like it requires some extra definitions or explaining, or maybe some personal or cultural context, please understand that I already devoted a large amount of time to doing that and don't like repeating myself. You can go watch it, I'll even link it in the description. With that necessary preamble out of the way, one thing you probably won't hear from me under any circumstances is the kind of basic bitch equivocation that grifters love to use. Theoretically, grifters can come from anywhere and produce any kind of content, but I think there's some very strong material reasons that there's a hack gap between the left media ecosystem and the right media ecosystem, even within creator spaces where hackery is more tolerated than in strictly professional industries. It only benefits people who have no standards to say things like, both of these things are the same actually, because somebody who is trying to make the ecosystem better would never say that. There are times when it's incumbent on people to pick a side, I think, and we should all follow the truth where it leads us as best we can. Lots of people will tell you things like that. Another favorite is the "it's not that deep" posts that come up whenever people are telling you not to use your brain. But this is especially silly when discussing an issue. If the positive and negative takes were always equivalent, nothing would ever happen and nobody would ever do anything. It's just a silly way in which the aesthetic of dualism overrides a real accounting of what's actually happening in society. This is hardly deep philosophy, so who should we turn to for shallow philosophy? That's right. This essay is about Ben Shapiro's no good, very bad Superman review, and other similar commentary posted to his YouTube channel. But who is Ben Shapiro? A man who almost never seems to require introduction. In search of answers, I roll back the clock and turn to the New York Times, specifically a 2017 article by Sabrina Tavernise. Quote, Mr. Shapiro, conservative thinker, entertainer, trash talker, and destroyer of weak arguments, has been called the voice of the conservative millennial movement. He represents the tastes of an emerging political class. If Rush Limbaugh is someone your dad listens to on his car radio, Mr. Shapiro, 33, a graduate of Harvard Law School, is the cool kid's philosopher, dissecting arguments with a lawyer's skill and references to Aristotle. He exists in places that young people inhabit: podcasts, Facebook, Twitter, and YouTube. His podcast, The Ben Shapiro Show, is downloaded 10 million times every month. 70% of his audience is under the age of 40. This article is infamous for other reasons, although these often get overlooked for want of a raw cringe factor. I have some beef with the way this article characterized the alt-right at the time. Tavernise writes that, quote, conservatives say he is a force for good. Liberals may not like his conclusions, but they are guiding young people at a time when the conservative movement is adrift, and ideas of white nationalism are competing for their attention. Mr. Shapiro, an Orthodox Jew, was one of the first to call out the alt-right movement. denouncing it as racist and anti-Semitic at a time when most people saw it as counterculture and cool. He paid a price. He received 38% of all anti-Semitic tweets aimed at journalists in 2016, the largest single share according to the Anti-Defamation League. I'm not sure what social circles Tavernise was running in at the time that caused her to come to the conclusion that, to use her words, most people saw the alt-right as cool when Ben Shapiro was describing it in negative terms. Shapiro's anti-alt-right stance was really borne out when he left Breitbart News in 2016. And of course, most Americans would not be as familiar with the term alt-right as they are even to begin with until the Charlottesville Unite the Right rally in 2017, which was organized by Richard Spencer, to whom the term alt-right is frequently attributed. The implication on Tavernise's terms seems to be that most people admired Spencer's movement, which could not have been further from the truth. By contrast, the more people learned about the alt-right, a now all but defunct term, too toxic for the American far-right to use to launder their views, the more it achieved that now implicit toxicity. Recent history has indicated the opposite. Most people did not know who these bozos were. When a fair few people learned, they were horrified or disgusted by what they saw. I would charitably describe Tavernise as being a bit out of touch with what most people knew or believed, but perhaps the article is simply poorly worded, and she only meant that most people on the political right, who already knew about the alternative right movement, regarded it that way prior to the increasing amount of violence associated with the movement. Still, this happenstance characterization of the American far-right aside, the association of Shapiro's harassment with anti-Semitism is itself noteworthy. Shapiro broke with a number of American conservatives in his criticism of Donald Trump, which is a bit of a lackluster metric for political identity, as viewed from anywhere else on the political spectrum. The real divide on the American right wing over Israel, once the third rail of American politics and now a prospect for realignment, also seems to have split him from some of his peers. As far as anti-Semitic harassment is concerned, I don't doubt that Shapiro has faced more than his share. What always raises my eyebrow at attempts to highlight this harassment by those sympathetic to Shapiro, and by Shapiro himself, is that it stands in stark contrast to his every attempt to contribute to the exact same treatment of members of every other marginalized demographic in society. Shapiro has contempt for basically every group in society whose membership he does not share. He loudly refuses to support marriage equality for gay couples. He supports bans on abortions, including cases of rape and incest, and calls women who receive them baby killers as well. He proclaims that transgenderism, to use his preferred term, is a mental illness, a position he actually maintained about homosexuality as well, dating back to his work for the Patriot Post. Quote, "Back in 1974, for example, the DSM removed homosexuality from its list of mental illnesses. There was no actual scientific reason to do so. Homosexual men still have higher rates of suicide and depression than heterosexuals. Homosexual women still have higher rates of substance abuse. Homosexuals are statistically deviant, a crucial issue when discussing normality in any statistical sense, and homosexuals are definitionally incapable of natural reproduction. But due to pressure group influence, homosexuality was out. The DSM then replaced homosexuality with ego-dystonic homosexuality, which they then defined as persistent lack of heterosexual arousal and distress from homosexual arousal. That wasn't good enough either, and in 1986 the DSM dumped it completely. What of the countless thousands who wish they could be treated for homosexuality? They don't matter, since the gay movement says that anyone with homosexual feelings should learn to be happy with those feelings, a position they don't take with regard to men who think they are women and vice versa." End quote. As it happens, Shapiro is either wildly ignorant of the science around this issue, or is simply lying about it. Firstly, he bases his description of what he considers a mental illness on what is normal, which isn't really the only issue at play. Lots of things aren't normal, but mental illnesses also have to do with things that interfere in the lives of the people experiencing them. Shapiro, in his usual way, tries to force the issue with word games by saying gay people are, to use his preferred wording again, statistically deviant, which is not a criteria for discussing normality, as he goes on to say, but rather a synonym for it. He's making an honest-to-dog tautological argument here, hardly the logic of a philosopher. Secondly, Shapiro's point actually highlights why he's wrong. It would be more unusual for a scientific view of this issue to not develop over time. Thirdly, and this is probably unsurprising to you if you clicked on this video, Shapiro insinuates without evidence that some kind of hidden agenda, which he dubs simply group influence, pressured the authors of the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual to alter its stance on gay issues. Hilariously, he tries to make this a point of hypocrisy by suggesting the political left should support transgender individuals if they really feel this way. The larger point here is that this is the sort of commentator we're sold as an alternative to the more extreme on the political right. What's important to note about all of that is that Shapiro seems to really believe these things, and if we were to take his name off these remarks, step back and add another one to the mix, maybe something about Jewish people, would that sentiment really be out of place? Would it really beggar the imagination to think that someone who is so fiercely antagonistic to so many groups of people would feel this way towards Jewish people? I think you would have to have a very specific point of view to argue otherwise. For most people, including those who are barely invested, one bigotry may seem as good as another. One would hope those fastidiously concerned with curbing anti-Semitism would therefore take an equally solemn approach to other various forms of bigotry. With Shapiro, that seems to not be the case. This is all relevant for one very funny reason. Any analysis of Superman as a comic book hero that you look for on YouTube will at some point mention that he is originally the brainchild of Jerry Siegel and Joe Shuster, who created him for Action Comics #1 in 1938. The character's name, however, had first been used in publication by the duo in 1933, The Reign of the Superman, where the eponymous Superman character is actually a villain. The pair would later retool the idea several times, ultimately landing on one where the heroic Superman would arrive to Earth from a distant planet. In commentary on the use of the name Superman, attributions for inspiration often reach for Friedrich Nietzsche's use of Übermensch, such as in his 1883 text, Thus Spoke Zarathustra, and this has sometimes been translated as Superman, despite a shift to use the potentially more accurate term Overman. This is obviously an iconic example, if a defunct one, but there are probably more accurate ones to both the character of Superman and Ben Shapiro's now infamous misunderstanding of the character. Many often attribute the use of the term Übermensch by Hitler and the Nazis in Germany to this text and Nietzsche more generally, but I'm not too sure. For starters, just because someone writes something before someone else doesn't necessarily entail a direct transmission between the two. That's just the thing, in fact. In America, there were famous use cases of the term Superman in advance of the political ascendance of the Nazi pseudoscience around race. Siegel allegedly attributed his inspiration for Superman as a character to, among other things, Tarzan from the 1912 story Tarzan of the Apes by Edgar Rice Burroughs. Republished as a novel in 1914, the story has one character refer to Tarzan as a Superman. This surely is closer to the kind of person we would picture. Tall, strong, flying through the air, and so on. But even this is not the point of origin often cited for the popularization of this term in the United States of America. That would be the 1903 George Bernard Shaw play Man and the Superman, whose anarchist male love interest was also a stand-in for Don Juan. There is, of course, a more specific and ideological precursor to the Nazis' use of the idea of the Übermensch and Untermensch. That would be Lothrop Stoddard, famous American eugenicist, Harvard PhD, and member of the Ku Klux Klan. Stoddard was born in 1883, the same year Thus Spoke Zarathustra was published, and graduated from university with his PhD in 1914, the same year of the first publication of the novel edition of Tarzan of the Apes. His work to advance the cause of racism was inspired in part by the work of fellow eugenicist Madison Grant, who would publish The Passing of the Great Race just 2 years after Stoddard received his PhD. In 1920, Stoddard laid the foundation for his own views on race with the publication of his book The Rising Tide of Color Against White World Supremacy, with a foreword by Grant. 2 years later, he would publish another, The Revolt Against Civilization, The Menace of the Underman. Among his most noteworthy accomplishments, besides getting annihilated in a famous debate on race issues by the famous academic and writer W.E.B. Du Bois, was Stoddard's association with the historical Nazi Party in Germany up through the Holocaust. In fact, of both Stoddard and Grant and the Holocaust, there is much that could be said. In her book, Caste: The Origins of Our Discontents, Isabel Wilkerson writes the following, quote, "A racial slur that the Nazis adopted in their campaign to dehumanize Jews and other non-Aryans, the word Untermensch, meaning subhuman, came to them from the New England-born eugenicist Lothrop Stoddard. A 1922 book he wrote carried the subtitle The Menace of the Underman, which translated Untermenschen in the German edition. The Nazis took the word as their own and would most become associated with it. They made Stoddard's book on white supremacy a standard text in the Reich's school curriculum, and accorded him a private audience with the purposely remote Adolf Hitler in the Reich Chancellery in December 1939. Well into World War II, Stoddard sat in on Nazi sterilization trials and commended the Nazis for weeding out the worst strains in the Germanic stock in a scientific and truly humanitarian way. He lamented, though, that, if anything, their judgments were almost too conservative. Madison Grant, a leading eugenicist from New York, whose social circle included Presidents Theodore Roosevelt and Herbert Hoover, converted his zeal for Aryan supremacy into helping enact a series of American immigration and marriage restrictions in the 1920s, as the Nazi Party was forming across the Atlantic. Grant went far beyond Southern segregationists in his contempt for marginalized people. He argued that inferior stocks should be sterilized and quarantined in a rigid system of elimination of those who are weak and unfit or perhaps worthless race types. Grant published a rabid manifesto for cleansing the gene pool of undesirables, his 1916 book, The Passing of the Great Race, a German edition of which held a special place in the Führer's library. Hitler wrote Grant a personal note of gratitude and said, "The book is my Bible." Hitler had studied America from afar, both envying and admiring it, and attributed its achievements to its Aryan stock. He praised the country's near genocide of Native Americans and the exiling to reservations of those who had survived. He was pleased that the United States had shot down the millions of Redskins to a few 100,000. He saw the U.S. Immigration Restriction Act of 1924 as a model for his program of racial purification, historian Jonathan Spiro wrote. The Nazis were impressed by the American custom of lynching its subordinate caste of African Americans, having become aware of the ritual torture and mutilations that typically accompanied them. Hitler especially marveled at the Aryan knack for maintaining an air of robust innocence in wake of mass death. By the time Hitler rose to power, the United States was not just a country with racism, Whitman, Yale legal scholar, wrote. It was the leading racist jurisdiction, so much so that even Nazi Germany looked to America for inspiration. The Nazis recognized the parallels even if many Americans did not. Setting aside my quibbles with some of the language, Wilkerson makes an excellent point in that somewhat unwieldy quotation I just read to you all. Indeed, Hitler premised much of what he did on American politics. It could therefore be inferred, without much exaggeration, that contemporary conservatives who maintain a more moderate, but still fundamentally chauvinistic doctrine of superiority along identitarian lines are operating in the shallow end of the traditions that inspired the Holocaust. A Jewish conservative concerned with rising anti-Semitism would, one hopes, see the dangers of these lines of thinking, but again, we seem to find that this is wishful thinking when we encounter Shapiro's work, which fails to rise to the occasion. There is a rich tradition for the American superhero with Jewish inspirations. Common examples of such figures include the great icons, like Captain America and, of course, Superman himself. We find ourselves washed upon strange shores in Ben Shapiro's commentaries on James Gunn's 2025 blockbuster, which debuted this summer and was titled simply Superman. Shapiro uploaded several videos about the film leading up to his review, which, in addition to the review itself, included a trailer breakdown and a video complaining about wokeness. Hey, over a quarter of an hour of your time and I finally got here. Great, awesome, this video is going to go down super well, I'm sure. At least this isn't a by-the-numbers anti-woke debunk, which is what I was trying to avoid this particular time. A lot of people have already talked about this, and it's easy to see why. Shapiro really kicked the hornet's nest with his incredibly silly trailer reaction back in April.
But don't worry, it gets worse. Once Superman is brought inside, a team of robots, presumably of Kryptonian origin, then starts to handle him, and they have one of the most nonsensical exchanges in any James Gunn movie, which is to say pretty nonsensical, orbiting the sun, which apparently was not available before. So the sun, which, as we all know, illuminates the Earth, which is the planet we are currently spinning on, apparently only the magnifying glass could make Superman better. We will notice the obvious incongruity of one robot explaining that the robots have no feelings, and then the female robot being giggly like a little girl at Superman. The entire attitude here is wrong. The entire attitude is wrong.
Now, Ben Shapiro, who is a published author, by the way, seems not to be grasping the style that James Gunn is going for here, if we're being charitable. He seems unaware that Gunn is trying to present a serious situation with humor for levity, not because Gunn doesn't want to tell a serious story, but because using less than serious elements, interspersed with the seriousness, actually makes this moment in the film less emotionally draining. If too much of a story is dour, audiences often disengage emotionally, whereas if you sprinkle some humor in between tense or sad or anxious moments, you can actually draw your audience into a back and forth that slowly advances something potentially darker. One of my favorite moments like this in scriptwriting, with which many of you may be familiar, is in the Peter Jackson adaptation of J.R.R. Tolkien's The Lord of the Rings: The Two Towers. The general arc of that film follows three separate sets of protagonists to the setup of the darkest part of the trilogy, including Frodo and Sam's entry into Mordor and the war in Gondor. To do this, Tolkien first has to set up and resolve the conflict in Rohan, which he foreshadowed in The Fellowship of the Ring, so that all the pieces can be in place for the return of the king. As such, The Two Towers, which even when it first came out achieved a pretty widely understood level of acclaim as a film, has a lot to balance as the middle point of a large and beautiful trilogy. Adapting these novels for film was always going to be a tall order, but the scriptwriters for The Two Towers did something intriguing when they inevitably altered the characters to make everything fit the film's structure. They made Gimli the dwarf a comic relief character in several scenes. The books have some amount of this built into them already, since the characters will sometimes have moments of levity in between big battles, or moments of solemn mourning. Aragorn in particular is one who I remember being more prone to laughing in the books than he is in the movies. But a film's structure can't really sustain everything in the original novel, and in the process of reworking the story to adapt it, the writers behind The Two Towers gave Gimli a lot of little moments, where he can quip about not enjoying their run over the fields of Rohan, or do little slapstick comedy bits in a fight. Discussions of this sort of thing often leave out why writers make this specific kind of change, and it's because it affects the pacing of the film's emotional moments. If you rewatch The Two Towers, pay close attention to what proportion of Gimli's on-screen moments involve him being serious or silly, and then try to track how those moments are distributed across the film's runtime. I almost guarantee you that what you'll find is that from the exposition and across the rising action, the jokes start out being somewhat frequent, but as the tone of the scenes become more uniformly tense and serious, so do his lines and character moments. This is done to help draw the audience into feeling the seriousness of the moment. If the film started serious, we would have nothing to compare it to. The whole thing would feel like a US Army recruitment advertisement, or, occasionally, a Snyder film. But by undercutting the serious with levity at the outset and then retracting that emotional current, the filmmakers allow the audience to feel a sense of withdrawal. The subject matter isn't merely telling them straightforwardly that the situation is serious, they're actually feeling that seriousness without being told, because they were given something to compare it to. If the heroes are having fun, then the audience won't take their danger as seriously. If the danger gets more serious but the heroes don't change their attitude, the audience's emotional resonance will be split between their empathy towards the character's situation and their empathy towards the character's reaction. If the characters are allowed to be silly as the situation is established, but they become more serious as the story darkens, the audience will be guided through the tone of the story in a manner that will feel almost effortless to them. That's half of why Superman 2025 is structured in the way that it is. The levity is always present, but sparser between climax and the resolution of the core conflict, those points being the opening of the rift in Metropolis and the closing of that same rift. Before that point, The characters being more silly despite their situation is actually strong writing, not bad writing. Additionally, and Ben Shapiro isn't the only person I've seen bring this up, to be fair, Superman getting his butt kicked at the start of the film and needing to recover quickly using focused sunlight to speed up his healing factor is actually perfectly reasonable as a writing decision as well. The story sees Superman overcoming someone who is out to get him and saving the world in the process. It is very clearly a struggle that begins with him at a low point and then gives him an arc for his character development, which in turn gives the audience multiple opportunities to engage with his character in a meaningful way. I'm not going to sit here and try to tell you it's a complete and total incomparable masterpiece, but Shapiro talks about it like Gunn just made a series of incorrect decisions, and despite what smug and hateful dorks on the internet would like you to believe, storytelling is not about making a series of correct moves and avoiding a series of common pitfalls. There's actually a lot more to it than that. Not one to be deterred by the massive thrashing his audience and literally everyone on social media who talked about his trailer reaction video had given him, Ben Shapiro moved to stay abreast of the discourse, with a video about how Superman is going woke. I really wish I could say he was above this, but as we've established, even a Harvard pedigree doesn't guarantee something like that.
Corin Sweat refused to say truth, justice, and the American way in a recent interview. Instead, he said truth, justice, and all that good stuff because he doesn't want to say the American way. The reality that Hollywood is so far to the left that they cannot take a core piece of Americana and just say it's about America. This has been a problem since basically after the original Christopher Reeve series. Every single iteration of Superman that's been made since then has avoided truth, justice, and the American way because they just refuse to acknowledge the American way is good, that the American way is in fact unique. And this lies at the root of a leftist worldview.
Shapiro is lying on several levels here. You might only consider it shading the truth for him to say that David Corenswet, the actor who plays Superman in the recent film, quote-unquote refused to say truth, justice, and the American way, or that he quote-unquote doesn't want to say the American way, both of which involve Shapiro projecting significantly onto Corenswet and directly making claims about what Corenswet desires to do. He also, and this is very fitting behavior for what we're about to witness, takes a slogan that was applied to Superman in a radio play adaptation and treats it like it's original to the character, humorously not applying this logic to Superman being raised by the Kents, who, as I recall, feature not in Action Comics #1 but in later storylines. Buffoons looking for cheap ways to get attention have been trying this for years, like Dean Cain when he got smacked down by Philip Kennedy Johnson in 2021. These are also Shapiro's tactics, of course, as he jingoistically uses James Gunn's film as an opportunity to do what a number of conservative media outlets tried to do: bait a reaction by decontextualizing something that can be spun into a conspiracy theory, which is all this woke Hollywood liberal agenda bullshit talking point ever is. This, rather appropriately, is an ideology fit only for children. Who decides what is American? Sometimes the American way might mean freedom of speech and religion and the press, and other times clearly not. Sometimes it means telling the presidential candidate your party ran to formally pardon a cop who kneeled on the neck of a suspect until he died, as Shapiro advocated Trump to do to Officer Derek Chauvin. Conservative media figures often extol the virtues of their morality as a method of hiding its excesses. If there are things worth loving about America, then there are also things worth hating, and appropriately the conservative movement seems to hate many things about America, but the language of loving America seems mostly fit to serve power. I made a remark about how the parrots of grifters use basic bitch equivocation earlier in this essay. Apologies for the inflammatory language, but I wanted to make sure you remembered it, and this is why. Equivocating fundamentally serves to remove the power that the truth has to remove itself from lies by stripping it of that distinction, and the same is true of moral equivocation. America produces some Clark Kents, but it also produces some Lex Luthors. Flattening our feelings towards America into the idea that America is simply great and good actually destroys the good things about it, because it reduces the good to the level of the bad and makes it all utterly indistinct. That's how people go from beating their chest about fighting for freedom to screeching about who they're going to round up and deport to foreign prisons without trial, inside a single sentence. Moreover, that kind of nationalism is a good fit for xenophobia, since it drowns out its overt bigotry with overtures of warm compassion and belonging. Shapiro isn't even subtle about this. He heads into it immediately off of the previous clip.
That leftist worldview is astonishingly anti-American. It really is. This hardcore left worldview that says that America is somehow uniquely bad. So if there is a comic book character who is built on the goodness of America, which is what Superman really is about, if Superman is an immigration story, for those who are not familiar with the origin story of Superman, who comes from the planet Krypton and then lands in America and then is brought up in a Midwestern household on a farm by his adoptive parents and integrated into true American values, and then goes to Metropolis and brings his sort of country values to the big city where crime is rife and where everybody is too cynical and sophisticated. And the whole point of Superman is that he's bringing these kind of classic American values to the big city. It's a riff on how New York kind of sucks in many ways, actually. Superman, the original, is very much about how the values of America are farm-bred and farm-born. Right? His moral center, his moral compass, Superman, is on the farm from his parents. That's why he takes the name Clark Kent. He's an immigrant who assimilates to American values and then brings those classic American values to the big city where he has to use them to defend the big city from enemies, foreign and domestic.
First things first, I don't know very many left-wing people who think that America is uniquely bad. I think there are plenty of people who treat the negative aspects of American society and American political influence as uniquely impactful in their time because of the scale of American power and influence. And even that, to me, goes a little too far and often leads to some misunderstandings about the origins of our problems. But that's not the way Ben Shapiro is characterizing the political left. Shapiro is talking about a group of people who, in my experience, are told on every other occasion that we just call everybody we don't like Nazis. I was under the impression that the Nazi Party was a German political party. If left-wingers are unfairly comparing people to Nazis, not a thing that never happens, although I think hysteria about the unfairness of the comparison is a little overblown, then if anything, left-wingers are being overly forgiving of the idea of America by locating America's negative qualities in other countries and using those nations as instructive examples. You see this a lot when the Trump administration does something and liberal commentators compare it to North Korea or China or Russia. But the reverse sort of argument can be equally tenable. As discussed previously in the lengthy quotation from Isabel Wilkerson, a lot of the negative qualities of the political initiative to purge all Jewish people from Europe actually can be traced back here to the United States of America. If Shapiro thinks America is so fundamentally good that to see it any other way is ludicrous, he must be working overtime to square that ideology with all the Jewish blood on its hands. But isn't that exactly what's happening here? Listen to how Shapiro talks about the country values of the Kents being real American values. Ben Shapiro was born in Los Angeles, California, to a mother who was a television executive and a father who was a composer. His parents are Hollywood millionaires. He went to UCLA and Harvard. He is as much of a coastal elite as anyone, to use a popular conservative media phrase that was in vogue when I was younger. He is posturing like crazy, and in the process he paints himself as someone who does not have real American values. Everything about the worldview Shapiro is purveying positions the type of people he seems to want to convince against his own success.
I mean, the original Superman is literally punching Hitler in the face. In the comics, he literally punches Hitler in the face. So, the attempt to separate Superman off from America is just a demonstration by the cultural left of how much they dislike America. And that's no shock, because when you take that over into the political sphere, full scale, what you end up is a different kind of immigrant, like the guy who may be the next mayor of New York, Zoran Mamdani. So, if you have a choice between immigrants who come to the United States, yes, on alien spacecraft, and land, and then are integrated into America and imbibe from the wellspring of American values, or Zoran Mamdani, you should pick Superman, because Zoran Mamdani is a disaster area. This guy is likely to be the next mayor of New York, and his absolute deep hatred for the country is so clearly apparent in everything that he's been doing for years on end. Again, he only became an American citizen like 6 years ago. So he put out a tweet in 2020 that showed him flipping off a statue of Christopher Columbus with the caption, "Take it down," because the idea is that Christopher Columbus is somehow deeply bad and deeply evil.
There's a lot to unpack here. This video is replete with Ben Shapiro's usual dishonest framings, turned up a notch to attack the Democratic candidate for mayor of New York City. He says, "if you have a choice," when describing different quote-unquote kinds of immigrants. But I don't know if I believe in that. I might not like certain people with certain beliefs, but I do support their freedom of movement. I think the insinuation that Mamdani is somehow not a real American or lacking in real American values, coming again from Shapiro, who by his own very stupid definition has no point of contact with those values, is disgusting. I have found that there are people who live on the opposite side of the planet who may have more in common with me philosophically than people who live down the street. If there is such a thing as American values, I would insist on a brand of American values much closer to what Mamdani seems to believe than what Shapiro preaches. But that's me. Now, because I couldn't let it go, and happened to have a copy on hand, thank you to my grandma and grandpa for giving me this when I was a kid, I dug out Howard Zinn's A People's History of the United States. While some have tried to slander Zinn for having some kind of far-left bias, his opening chapter concerning Columbus and other colonial expeditions and settlements to the Americas is worth a read, especially given his sourcing of his claims. Even other historians who I see speak on this issue in a more recent historical context will use sources like the Journal of Christopher Columbus and the historical work of Bartolomé de las Casas. Las Casas was an eyewitness testimony to much of what he described as having occurred over the years in the Indies, and of course Columbus was the perpetrator with whom we are chiefly concerned here for the purposes of this essay. Zinn opens his passage on the misdeeds of Columbus thusly, quote, "Arawak men and women, naked, tawny, and full of wonder, emerged from their villages onto the island's beaches, and swam out to get a closer look at the strange boat. When Columbus and his sailors came ashore carrying swords, speaking oddly, the Arawaks ran to greet them, brought them food, water, gifts. He later wrote of this in his log. They brought us parrots and balls of cotton and spears and many other things, which they exchanged for the glass beads and hawk's bells. They willingly traded everything they owned. They were well built, with good bodies and handsome features. They do not bear arms and do not know them, for I showed them a sword, and they took it by the edge and cut themselves out of ignorance. They have no iron. Their spears are made of cane. They would make fine servants. With 50 men we could subjugate them all and make them do whatever we want." End quote. After describing the motive for Columbus's venture in the establishment of the fort on Hispaniola, made from the salvage of the Santa Maria, Zinn goes further in citing Columbus's express aims to subjugate and enslave the natives. Quote, "The Indians," Columbus reported, "are so naive and so free with their possessions that no one who has not witnessed them would believe it. When you ask for something they have, they never say no. To the contrary, they offer to share it with anyone." He concluded his report by asking for a little help from their majesties, and in return he would bring them, from his next voyage, as much gold as they need and as many slaves as they ask. He was full of religious talk. Thus the eternal God our Lord gives victory to those who follow his way over apparent impossibilities. Zinn describes how, in his second voyage with 17 ships as opposed to his original 3, he struggled to produce for the Spanish court his promised gains. Quote, "But too many of the slaves died in captivity, and so Columbus, desperate to pay back dividends to those who had invested, had to make good his promise to fill the ships with gold. In the province of Cacao on Haiti, where he and his men imagined huge gold fields to exist, they ordered all persons 14 years or older to collect a certain quantity of gold every 3 months. When they brought it, they were given copper tokens to hang around their necks. Indians found without a copper token had their hands cut off and bled to death. The Indians had been given an impossible task. The only gold around was bits of dust gathered from the streams. So they fled, were hunted down with dogs, and were killed. Trying to put together an army of resistance, the Arawaks faced Spaniards who had armor, muskets, swords, horses. When the Spaniards took prisoners, they hanged them or burned them to death. Among the Arawaks, mass suicides began, with cassava poison. Infants were killed to save them from the Spaniards. In 2 years, through murder, mutilation, or suicide, half of the 250,000 Indians on Haiti were dead. When it became clear that there was no gold left, the Indians were taken as slave labor on huge estates, later known as encomiendas. They were worked at a ferocious pace and died by the thousands. By the year 1515, there were perhaps 50,000 Indians left. By 1550, there were 500. A report of the year 1650 shows none of the original Arawaks or their descendants left on the island." End quote. In drawing upon the work of the eyewitness priest Las Casas and his multi-volume History of the Indies, Zinn writes at length about the extent of the suffering of the indigenous population, not just in numerical terms, but also concrete experiential ones. Quote, "Las Casas tells how the Spaniards grew more conceited every day, and after a while refused to walk any distance. They rode the backs of Indians if they were in a hurry, or were carried on hammocks by Indians running in relays. In these cases, they also had Indians carry large leaves to shade them from the sun, and others to fan them with goose wings. Total control led to total cruelty. The Spaniards thought nothing of knifing Indians by 10s and 20s, and of cutting slices off them to test the sharpness of their blades. Las Casas tells how 2 of these so-called Christians met 2 Indian boys one day, each carrying a parrot. They took the parrots for fun and beheaded the boys. The Indians' attempts to defend themselves failed, and when they ran off into the hills they were found and killed. So, Las Casas reports, they suffered and died in the mines and other labors in desperate silence, knowing not a soul in the world to whom they could turn for help." He describes their work in the mines. Mountains are stripped from top to bottom and bottom to top 1,000 times. They dig, split rocks, move stones, and carry dirt on their backs to wash it in the rivers, while those who wash gold can stay in the water all the time with their backs bent so constantly it breaks them. And when water invades the mines, the most arduous task of all is to dry the mines by scooping up pans full of water and throwing it up outside. After each 6 or 8 months' work in the mines, which was the time required of each crew to dig enough gold for melting, up to 1/3 of the men died. While the men were sent many miles away to the mines, the wives remained to work the soil, forced into the excruciating job of digging and making thousands of hills for cassava plants. Thus husbands and wives were together only once every 8 or 10 months, and when they met they were so exhausted and depressed on both sides they ceased to procreate. As for the newly born, they died early, because their mothers, overworked and famished, had no milk to nurse them, and for this reason, while I was in Cuba, 7,000 children died in 3 months. Some mothers even drowned their babies from sheer desperation. In this way, husbands died in the mines, wives died at work, and children died from lack of milk. And in a short time, this land, which was so great, so powerful and fertile, was depopulated. My eyes have seen these acts so foreign to human nature, and now I tremble as I write. When he arrived on Hispaniola in 1508, Las Casas says, there were 60,000 people living on this island, including the Indians, so that from 1494 to 1508, over 3 million people had perished from war, slavery, and the mines. Who in future generations will believe this? I myself, writing it as a knowledgeable eyewitness, can hardly believe it. Thus began the history 500 years ago of the European invasion of the Indian settlements in the Americas. That beginning, when you read Las Casas, even if his figures are exaggerations, were there 3 million Indians to begin with, as he says, or less than 1 million, as some historians have calculated, or 8 million, as others now believe, is conquest, slavery, death. When we read the history books given to children in the United States, it all starts with heroic adventure. There is no bloodshed, and Columbus Day is a celebration. End quote. I regret how much of this video is going to be long quotations like that when you all have the opportunity to view or listen to it. I try to place on-screen elements like blocks of text when bringing up longer quotations, and I anticipate there will be many of those here, but my purpose in longer quotations from figures like Wilkerson or Zinn or anyone else is not to condemn Columbus or Stoddard or any other minds behind any number of massacres. There's a fundamental through line here, I feel, in how Ben Shapiro talks about human beings and the issues they face in their real day-to-day lives, their struggles, their achievements, their social landscapes. Shapiro set out to make his discussion of James Gunn's Superman a matter of identity, specifically American identity and Superman's identity. He attempted to use the platform he has accrued over years and years of operating among the political commentariat to excoriate Gunn, and Cornsweet as well, for breaking from a specific idealized vision of America even for the sake of telling an uplifting humanitarian story. There's a delicious irony to savor here in how Ben Shapiro is basically doing to Zoran Mamdani what Lex Luthor would go on to do to Superman in the film itself when it debuted. For those who haven't seen it, Superman has a recording from his birth parents that is damaged when he crashes to Earth. Luthor infiltrates the Fortress of Solitude and reconstructs the recording to share it globally, and undermines Superman's reputation. Luthor's direct insinuation about Superman is that he's an alien invader who is, and he uses this word, attempting to groom humanity so he can conquer them. In the end, Superman's triumph also involves him explaining himself to Luthor, showing that he's a person just like anyone and he's trying to do his best. Now, consider the following. If you were going to paint someone falsely as an outside threat, would you not do something very similar to what both Ben Shapiro and Lex Luthor do? Just some food for thought. In fact, let's look at Ben Shapiro's actual review of Superman 2025 for some insight into what he has to say about the Kents.
His parents, Ma and Pa Kent, in the original, they are noble and they are wise. They're kind of salt of the earth. Here, they're basically kind of, I don't know, like down home types who don't seem to, they live in a kind of a crappy house. They're the kind of people who call the TV the box. They're the kind of folks who are sitting around and you know, kind of scratching their butts. They're purposely cast as ugly and non-noble. It doesn't mean everything they say is bad. It isn't, but, and by the way, both of them are alive in this, right? The original Superman mythos is that Pa Kent dies, and that's what sends Superman on his journey.
It's very clear that, misunderstandings of Superman's backstory aside, the Kents aren't original, they're introduced a bit later, although I like them a lot. Much like how people who do not live in urban and suburban environments often flanderize the best or worst aspects of those living situations, to the point of imagining them to be entirely different environments when compared to the actual experiences of the Americans who live there, Shapiro has a similarly fictional view of rural life in America. When I saw the film, it did not even occur to me to think that the house the Kents lived in was at all run down. It's actually a pretty normal house. I've known people who have lived in houses like this. I've stayed in the guest bedrooms of houses like this. It's not crappy, it's normal. Lots of people in environments like this would be perfectly happy living in such a house. Shapiro is so out of touch that he doesn't even seem to register that the phrase salt of the earth is often used self-awarely but ironically by people who look down on such individuals. He sounds like a total elitist talking this way about the Kents in basically the same way he does when he talks about most other groups of people. In America, many elections give conservative presidential candidates a solid chance of victory, specifically because of the manner in which the Electoral College allocates votes with respect to divisions along congressional districts, with the total votes being the total number of districts plus 2, one for each senator. A common talking point pillorying the legitimacy of this practice is that land doesn't vote, and sure enough, Shapiro seems to think that in accordance with America's population density being concentrated in and around cities, most Americans don't have real American values. This is nonsense and just another form of elitism, but it should at least theoretically work on people in his own conservative audience to whom he might pander, provided they live in a rural area. Shapiro, however, has shown himself to be so utterly out of touch and have such severe disregard for rural Americans and their actual living conditions that I have to wonder if anybody not in a city or a suburb still listens to him. In fact, why does anybody listen to Ben Shapiro? He talks down to city folks, he talks down to rural folks. He hates his whole audience, and it's never been more obvious. That is, I would be tempted in another era, maybe, to playfully ask, why does anyone watch Ben Shapiro? But, you know, the embarrassing nature of his commentary on Superman 2025 caused me to really consider the reality of this situation in harsher terms. Shapiro's series of videos produced on this subject are undeniably stupid and hateful towards just about the entire human race. What concerned me, however, and why I took so long to talk about this, was that I was asking myself, given that people will see this and continue to watch him, why? I couldn't help but try to contextualize this behavior. Many political figures, including and perhaps especially those to Shapiro's right on the political spectrum, aren't especially friendly towards most human beings and engage in a not so surprising but nevertheless shocking degree of dehumanization in their rhetoric. In fact, from Donald Trump to Adolf Hitler, many different figures seem to have engaged in this specific behavior. But how do their followers seem to parse it? We can't necessarily trust all the rhetoric, but we can trust the constancy of certain behaviors, and it seems factually apparent to me that people rally behind a Shapiro or a Trump for reasons like this. They might not even really like the person underneath the facade, but they could find them useful. I personally don't tend to follow people I don't like, and I certainly don't leap to defend them purely on the basis of who they tell me to hate. But even that framing is too forgiving, isn't it? Masses of Americans, like masses of Germans previously, are not being totally tricked and hoodwinked, as much as the deception is central to this strategy. Lying might be core to the problem, but when they become aware of the lies, why not discard the liars? Why be so comfortable with the lies, as we've, for example, seen in so many street interviews with Trump supporters, like the ones conducted by Jordan Klepper, which I can't show you because YouTube's Content ID system is not friendly to people who cite clips for the purposes of fair use. Let me rephrase. I think we see this behavior from politicians to social media influencers, so it's worth examining, and to do so, I'd like to pull up an old favorite source of mine. In Milton Mayer's They Thought They Were Free, he chronicles his personal engagement with former Nazi Party members in Germany after the end of World War II. Mayer, a Jewish educator and writer, has some of the most compelling commentaries on individual Nazis ever written, in my opinion, especially since he eschewed the subject of the High Command almost entirely, and fixated instead on a group of men others might have neglected. The idea was to befriend and interview random, regular people who became Nazis. Mayer's conclusions are chilling. Quote, "My friends wanted Germany purified. They wanted it purified of the politicians, of all the politicians. They wanted a representative leader in place of unrepresentative representatives. And Hitler, the pure man, the anti-politician, was the man untainted by politics, which was only a cloak for corruption. The mink coat scandal in the United States at the beginning of the 1950s had its counterpart in Berlin in the beginning of the 1930s, when the Nazis focused their campaign for the mayoralty on the receipt by the wife of the Social Democratic mayor of a fur coat from a man who did business with the city. Against the whole pack, the whole caboodle, the whole business, against all the parliamentary politicians and all the parliamentary parties, my friends evoked Hitlerism, and Hitlerism overthrew them all. The power struggle within the National Socialist Party, which culminated in the Rome Purge of June 30, 1934, was in essence parliamentary and political, but my friends never knew it. They accepted it as a cleanup of moral degenerates, and if they caught a glimpse of the reality underneath the official propaganda, their nascent concern was dissipated by the fact that the Führer acted with an instant and terrible sword, and the debate with Rome was finished. The Führer held the country and the countrymen together." End quote. As Mayer seems to see it, the key desires of those who he elsewhere terms the little men of Nazi Germany were a motivator for the Holocaust. This occurred in spite of his estimation that the majority of the men with whom he spoke were not ardent anti-Semites. What I learned from reading Mayer's work was, although it had taken me some time to apply this, to treat the intentions of the supporters of fascism and the ends of fascism as distinct but causally related in a way that specifically allows me to put my finger on one thing. People like Ben Shapiro exist not merely to exploit their audiences, but in some ways to be exploited by them. This is dangerous. It is a fantasy to believe that a small coterie of evil men are tricking the world, albeit a sympathetic and idealistically democratic fantasy. The reality is somewhat different. Many people are indeed tricked. They are propagandized to, after all, as we all are. But deception alone does not account for this situation, as I've said. Desire is a large part of self-deception. What can we draw from this in a positive sense? It's helpful to critique society, as this gives us greater understanding to motivate, contextualize, and guide our actions. Understanding is necessary, but many people will want something more upon being confronted with this brutal, hateful, destructive, and nihilistic continuity between these ideas. Mayer has a few words of reflection later on. Quote, "What I really want, since, while I want to let my friends off in my magnanimity, I do not want to have to reproach myself some time later with having let them escape the consequences of their unheroism, is for each of them to have cared enough at the time to have thrown himself under the iron chariot of the state, with its wheels rimmed with spikes. This none of my friends did, and this I cannot forgive them. They did not care enough." End quote. Many people will accept the lie even if they prefer the truth, and accept the anti-Semitism or other bigotries, like anti-immigrant sentiment, even if they do not prefer the hatred itself, because for them these achieve something. But against such destructive social forces, we need people who are willing to seize on their moments to resist. This is going to, as one of Mayer's interviews stated, require that many people like you and me take that moment when it presents itself. One of Mayer's friends described one such small moment when it presented itself to him. He told Mayer he could have prevented the whole Holocaust, and he meant it. Quote, "There I was, in 1935, a perfect example of the kind of person who, with all his advantages in birth, in education, and in position, rules or might easily rule in any country. If I had refused to take the oath in 1935, it would have meant that thousands and thousands like me all over Germany were refusing to take it. Their refusal would have heartened millions. Thus the regime would have been overthrown, or indeed, would never have come into power in the first place. The fact that I was not prepared to resist in 1935 meant that all the thousands, hundreds of thousands like me in Germany were also unprepared, and each one of these hundreds of thousands was, like me, a man of great influence or of great political influence. Thus the world was lost." "You are serious?" I said. "Completely," he said. "These 100 lives I saved, or 1,000 or 10 as you will, what do they represent? A little something out of the whole terrible evil when, if my faith had been strong enough in 1935, I could have prevented the whole evil." End quote. It's the little people, of one sort or another, and in all our various degrees, who have a power in proportion to their station, which is comparably lower, and their commensurately greater number in a society of the rule of the many by the few. In many respects, the United States of America is such a society. That we are failing to see our mutual humanity across divides where there should rightly be no dispute is a core part of the problem. But if we could challenge the nature of those divides, we might be able to dispute the terms of the conflict, and likewise, if we could see that we are all somebody else to somebody else and act accordingly, we might find that each of us has power as a lone individual, precisely because no individual is ever alone. Many people who have no great distinction will need to find their moment of faith in the face of tyranny before this crisis is concluded. I always assumed that the point of the Kents is that they're normal people. They looked normal in the film to me, not ugly. 2 human beings, being the best humans they can be, raised Superman to be the best person he can be, and they probably would have done it if their farm was in Mexico or Canada as well. At least that was my interpretation. But maybe that's because I saw them and I assumed they were like my parents or the parents of people I knew. I'm not from a rural area, but as a kid I didn't think that mattered beyond being good cover to hide an alien child. The Kents are good people. They love Clark, and they both treat him right and taught him to treat others right. They live in a normal house and lead normal lives and have normal problems. And it's that kind of background that allows Superman to be the kind of person he ultimately is, I feel. Whereas Ben Shapiro seems to have another thesis. He seems to think that superior people need to come from superior places, or otherwise that Superman is great because he's better than the people with whom he surrounds himself in Metropolis. I don't think Superman generally sees it that way. He seems, most of the time at least, to want to be like one of those people, and it's that same impulse that motivates him to help. I really hate the way conservatives talk about cities. I recently posted something on Twitter about Peacemaker Season 2, and a bunch of dumb stuff I was seeing people say about it, and the crazy thing is, despite the fact that I spent a significant amount of my childhood in a white majority suburban environment, I had people, blue check Twitter users, so maybe bots, but still, telling me I was from a quote-unquote ethnic shithole and they could tell. I guess growing up in the suburbs and telling people that the suburbs aren't utopian, even if you're basically surrounded by white people, isn't a perspective that's welcome in a lot of conversations where conservatives bellyache online about city life. But whose fault is that? That Sabrina Tavernise article talked about how Ben Shapiro got all that anti-Semitic harassment on Twitter, and that's wrong, but it's also something he's very much feeding into and has for years by keeping this delusional hate-mongering about cities and crime alive. As I was working on putting this and some other videos together, the anniversary of the September 11th terror attacks on the World Trade Center came and went. I didn't personally know anyone in the towers, I was a small child after all, and I think the chest beating over that tragedy has sort of ground it shamelessly into being a low point in a very shameful period of American national identity. But those victims, a lot of them, are the kind of people Ben Shapiro talks about being too sophisticated and lacking real American values. Similar things could be said for all the people who are trying to help, including the first responders who lost their lives just trying to save others. I don't usually wax poetic about stuff like this, because I think it can be in poor taste, but let's be clear about one thing. Tragedies like this are real and could happen again, and they remind us of the value and fragility of human life. I don't think we should mourn people just because they have the right national identity. I don't think that's what gives a life value, and as far as I know, neither would Superman. It's disgusting to talk about people who live in cities as if they're somehow unclean and unworthy. Millions upon millions of Americans live in urban and suburban environments. They are real human beings, and they too are the source of our highest values. We've talked a lot here about the idea of a Superman and what it means, and what he means for us, and really how we should think of ourselves in general. It's always struck me that insecure people need to take pride in something like a national identity. It's not like saying you have pride in being part of a marginalized group in the sense that you refuse to be ashamed of your identity. The jingoism of Ben Shapiro's worldview has no place in a civilized society. But Superman's ideals do. There's a version of Superman that speaks to a lot of us. It's the one we can see in the 1999 animated film, The Iron Giant. When the giant sacrifices himself to stop the nuke from blowing up all those people in that city, he remembers his friend Hogarth's words. You are who you choose to be. Being like Superman means elevating ourselves to the version of ourselves that strives to move beyond our circumstances, not being constrained by them. I think when we look up in hope, we're looking for a higher version of ourselves. That's Superman.